we need to be very mindful and clear-eyed to the fact that traceability and continuous visibility of critical mineral supply chains that lend to national economic security is incredibly important, not just for companies, but also our nations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Alberto Rosende, your host and CEO of M2I Global, a critical minerals supply chain company, and this is the Minerals Metals Initiative, a podcast exploring the transformation of the critical minerals supply chain as we race for global resilience, from mineral extraction and refinement to policy and innovation. Join us each episode as we examine a different aspect of the urgent push to modernize, diversify, and de-risk the world's critical minerals supply chain. Joining us today to talk about supply chain traceability is Ellen Carey. Ellen is an executive leader for global policy, critical minerals, and clean tech supply chains, with expertise in regulatory strategy and market creation. Ellen was formerly the Chief External Affairs Officer at Circular, a company that brings traceability and sustainability to supply chains. As the Chief External Affairs Officer, Ellen led market-shaping efforts focused on critical minerals, clean energy, and transparent, reliable supply chains. With more than 15 years of experience advancing major policy frameworks, guiding international and domestic regulatory strategies, and building cross-sector coalitions that strengthen clean tech deployment and industrial resilience. Her work has centered on creating full value chain visibility and distinguishing responsibly sourced materials and products from those lacking traceability. Today, Ellen applies her experience and focus to advancing traceability as a core tool for rebuilding secure, competitive, and accountable supply chains globally. Ellen, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Al, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here with you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Ellen, before we jump into traceability, tracking, and tracing, can you give us a little bit of background and how you wound up in such an exciting field?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's incredibly exciting. I think when I reflect on my 20-plus year career, there's always been one through line that connects it all, and that has been really working at the intersection of policy and business and advocacy, where our economies and our national securities have concentrated risks, and then helping to scale emerging technologies that can help solve for those concentrated risks and those dependencies. So at the very beginning of my career, that was in power generation, helping to advance renewable energy in the U.S. economy. I went on to work on the transportation side for a think tank and an automaker in the States, specifically on advancing electric vehicles and battery technology into transportation, especially because of transportation system, its dependence on oil and the impacts that has. And then recently, over the last 4 or 5 years, that same passion in my career has led me to the risks that are within our supply chains and how we start gaining visibility of the risks within our supply chains. And then how do we start changing markets and behaviors and demand mechanisms so that we start seeing and changing those supply chains, especially for greater economic and national security purposes.
So, you talk about concentrated risks. So how does traceability link to the risks of supply chains, particularly in manufacturing and industry, which is the basis of many economies, right?
Yeah, I think traceability, it's very important to talk about what traceability is and what it is not. What I like to think of in terms of traceability is a tool. It is a tool for continuous visibility of inherited upstream activity. And we need to be clear that for downstream manufacturers, many of them do not know their tier 4, tier 5, tier 6, et cetera. And so we need to start talking about, and thankfully now we have digital technologies that can be applied. We have industrial IoT systems that can provide not an annual audit of a supply chain, but a continuous visibility mechanism that provides a reliable proof of a provenance of a mineral or material, as well as the geographical flow of that material into a product. So it's going to be enabling us to differentiate first, see supply chains, right? Second, differentiate minerals and materials. And third, apply policies, whether that be incentives or trade or restrictions or regulations, to start spurring demand for some and not other supply chain activity. I hope that helps, Alan. If I can go into any more detail on that, or if that needs to answer your question more directly, I'm glad to.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is maybe open it up and maybe use an example of how traceability really helps reduce the risk within the supply chain. Now, you said way upstream, there's a lot of activity that's going on, so manufacturers don't really understand what the details are related to the material that they're utilizing in their manufacturing industrial process. So if you could maybe take us through an example and highlight a particular risk to really understand how traceability will help us mitigate or remediate that particular risk of entering into the supply chain.
Mineral material supply chain that is often called upon is nickel. We can get nickel from Australia, from our friends at BHP in Western Australia, where they're doing a lot of their mining activities with renewable energy. They're mitigating the risks in the upstream. And we can get our nickel from Indonesia, and particularly any Chinese-owned companies and production in Indonesia. The latter is known to have significant embedded carbon and also to have degradation to the environment in those processes. That does come with risks for the downstream who are increasingly needing to prove where their upstream minerals, critical minerals, are coming from, and that it's responsibly, ethically, and sustainably produced. Now, something we need to keep in mind, though, is that in the US or in Australia, holding that higher standard of operation and protecting the environment and doing that extraction and processing with responsibility and with a high degree of responsibility does come with added cost. And in some places, that can be 3 to 5 times the capex as to the alternative on the marketplace today. And so traceability can also help differentiate and apply pricing or pricing mechanisms to certain minerals and materials because they don't come with those risks. They're sourced from a responsible allied producer like Australia, and that resiliency within the supply chain can be seen, incentivized, and rewarded.
So I think you mentioned a couple of things there that are very important to understand. I think it's obvious that the more processing requirements that are placed on the source entity that's sourcing the material, then obviously the downstream price at each point goes higher. And so there is a cost to traceability. But that is the financial cost. But if you could talk a little bit on how traceability really supports that selection of the source material. And I know that we had another podcast where they talked about environmental degradation, and I know that that's an aspect of what traceability helps us get after. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I like to think about how it's not traceability or upstream standards. It's the combination of both that's really powerful. So let's move to lithium, right? You have major producers in SQM and Albemarle who have done a lot to achieve a rating with IRMA in terms of the responsibility of their extraction and their processing. Now, when you couple that with traceability, carrying that IRMA certificate, a third-party trusted certificate from IRMA, to a downstream supplier, they can then see that they have evidence, they have data, and they have verification that the mineral and material they're receiving is upholding a high quality and high standard of responsibility.
Now, IRMA is still voluntary, right? It's not required anywhere.
No. And again, it's not one or the other. And on traceability, it's going to be that supply chain visibility, and then that coupling with third-party auditors, standard setters to carry that information downstream. Some other things, Al, in terms of, I know you just spoke also about circularity, right? So if we want increasing, circular recycled content that is made in the US, right? We need to be differentiating that is US recycled content, and that's deserving of incentives or marketability, et cetera. So traceability also helps prove that recycled content. And we can also apply traceability to products themselves to ensure that a product, a very, critical mineral rich product like a battery, stays within borders and is put back into that circular economy.
Right. In the work that we're doing, we're also working with a lot of battery recycling entities, organizations. One of our partners is in Europe, and I know that they've established this whole set of rules, most of them voluntary, to help improve the recycling of lead acid batteries and other types of batteries. I think that you could probably delve into it and explain that a little bit, and especially going to the product passport or the battery passport that they've included, and then it extends kind of to an overall product passport. And how does that then lend itself to improving the traceability, and whether it's a regulatory requirement or voluntary, and how that's moving along?
Yeah, certainly. I would say that where I sit here in Germany, Germany has really been a leader in battery passports and supply chain integration. They've funded with German federal funds a project called the Battery Pass Project that fleshed out the data point details and the technical standard details about how you start using a digital ecosystem to trace, to gain upstream supply chain information and trace these batteries between different value chain participants. And that work has been folded into the European batteries regulation. Now, this took effect in 2023, and it comes into effect in different stages over the next decade. The next thing will be a battery passport that's mandated for all electric vehicles, light means of transport, and industrial batteries for the European market. Again, to have transparency and traceability of batteries placed on the marketplace. But so I think Europe has really led in that regard. The US has followed with supply chain provisions like those that were included in the Section 30D tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act, saying that to achieve these tax credits and to achieve public taxpayer funds, there needed to be validation of where critical minerals were extracted, processed, put into battery components, and put into certain cars and battery packs of cars. Now the 30D tax credit goes away, the U.S. Treasury Department has applied the same approach to stationary storage batteries and the 45X battery components and critical minerals tax credits. So we're seeing a trend there. And we've got a coming together as well in terms of product passports with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, as well as tax incentives, and increasingly a harmonization between the U.S. and European counterparts to create standards policies that aren't too onerous and aren't a patchwork for downstream OEMs and manufacturers to follow. So that's really culminated, Al, and something that I think we should be really proud of and excited about and help support moving forward is that in October, the G7 plus 3 of its signatories agreed to traceability in critical minerals. And that is the application of traceability of critical minerals, graphite, lithium, cobalt, nickel, all of those things, but also the application of product passports, the use of traceability of products and minerals and materials into procurement, defense, and also the creation of the work on interoperability of how data is going to talk to each other among allied nations and how we're going to have that visibility. So we've built kind of domestically. I think different governments have been watching one another And now we've kind of harmonized multilaterally. Still lots to do in terms of the domestic application and bilateral applications of that traceability. But we're certainly filling out the framework.
When it comes to traceability, I know that, like you mentioned earlier, or through your responses, that there are several nations, or like the EU, that are building these kinds of voluntary requirements, and then moving then probably to mandate them at some point in the future. What does that do to the countries where a lot of these minerals come from, where there really isn't an awful lot of development yet, that they're moving forward? How does that impact those nations where we see those minerals coming from, particularly, let's say, in Africa or somewhere in Asia or in Latin America?
Actually, in Africa, there is quite a bit of traceability on the upstream to ensure that minerals and the value add is happening within country and continent. So we're not talking about fully building out traceability. We're actually talking about connecting, in some cases, from the provenance and the source to the desire to the downstream OEMs and or manufacturers, right? So we have that traceability on the upstream as well in many cases. And now we need to be talking about what data points and what technical specifications create interoperability and exchange. Now, you mentioned some voluntary standards on the European side. I think there's about 3 policies, I think, that are quite exciting on the US side, which is one, Department of War procurement. The Department of War has put in place a requirement for rare earth monitoring traceability for magnets, and that will take effect next year. And they've just extended that also to batteries, which will take effect, I think, in 2027. You've also got trade provisions, right? Policies like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act says that anything that is mined, processed, manufactured wholly or in part with forced labor cannot come will be seized by the U.S. government. Now, we're talking in both of those about how, and those policies they're in force, they are requirements, and we need to be working between industry, data providers, government, as well as the supply chain participants to really showcase what is best practice in terms of creating a reliable proof of provenance and geographical flow to show where those minerals materials have originated from and that they ended up where they were supposed to.
What do you think as you look across the landscape, particularly in the United States, where a lot of our minerals still come from overseas? Where are the friction points in being able to have a fully transparent, if you will, supply chain? Obviously, we hopefully look out 10 years and we'll see a different landscape as far as sourcing minerals in the United States. But currently, what do you think the challenges are to really putting in a fully transparent and traceable supply chain?
It's stream participation. We've had some good starts in terms of traceability. We need to be a lot more buttoned up in terms of and prescriptive on what exactly we're asking for. And that prescriptiveness can come with both the policies, the guidance, and specific standards that apply to those policies. So we can't be thinking about this in a conceptual way or a theoretical way. We need to be very mindful and clear-eyed to the fact that traceability and continuous visibility of critical mineral supply chains that lend to national economic security is incredibly important, not just for companies, but also our nations, right? And so we need to have our policies aligned in such a way that that data that is needed from upstream supply chains and from the value chain participants is very clear and prescriptive about what's required.
How reliable are the traceability standards that we have right now? I know that you're talking about the digital capture of information throughout the chain of custody as that material travels to its utilization point in industry. So how does the standards that are built help us capture that data to ensure that it is reliable and that they are immutable throughout the process, and that other material isn't introduced to take advantage of the material that is being tracked?
That's a very astute question, Al, because it's very much a mixed bag right now. Different policies require different stringency in terms of mixing on minerals and materials. Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, if you uphold its strictest interpretation, zero mixing. So we're talking about segregated supply chains, zero de minimis. Now, tax credits may take a different form, right? So you can apply a mass balance approach. So when we look at what we've got to do, we've got to look at the policies that need to be incorporated. We need to look at standards from neutral third-party standard setters like SAE, ASTM, ISO, things like that, that can be applied specifically to that policy. We also need to potentially be looking at annexes to those standards that account for the unique characteristics of certain materials in their value chains. Copper, quartz, cobalt, they operate very differently. So that's really the work that needs to be done. But I think there is a spirit these days in terms of getting very tactical, right? Not looking at everything as, as a broad brush stroke, but saying, okay, you've got these priority one critical minerals that we're going to apply certain policies to, and we need to be very tactical about how we gain that supply visibility, and then we operationalize and execute on the policy.
How do you see it being implemented along those lines? Which materials are the ones that become priority? I know that, like, let's say the EU has the 3TGs, conflict minerals requirements, the London Metal Exchange, obviously in the UK has something as well. How do you see that being applied as far as priority or specific nations or specific projects? How do you see that moving forward?
We've really got to start talking about, and this is why this conversation, Alan, your focus on this is really important because we've got a lot of educating to do. What are we talking about when we're talking about traceability? What does that look like? For which policies? For which materials? How will we know? And then can we analyze at the supply chain that these policies and this effort is reducing concentrated risks?
Right.
This is the work. This is the work we need to do.
And the way I see it as well is once you put in incentives, that means that federal governments throughout the world are providing incentives for folks to ensure that their material is being traced, then it has to be audited. And that auditing function independently is a whole separate process to validate the traceability aspect, especially when you're talking about the digital information that accompanies the material. And that's really the source of your ability to audit, isn't it, at this point?
Yeah, it's a multi-layer approach. So you're going to want data points from your industrial supply chain participants, and you're also going to want certain documents, bills of lading, et cetera, attached and specified to certain minerals and materials. And then to your point, yes, there will need to be trust and verification and validation that that information is what's actually happening.
In the world, let's say, of traceability, there's many technologies, whether it's the blockchain, the digital twin, and then there's some physical taggants or applications of those. What do you see as far as moving forward, or what have you seen so far? Any physical taggants that are applied that are then measured at some point, moving through the process that helps validate the source, that helps validate the digital twin that's kind of accompanying the material? What are you seeing developing in the world of traceability and tracking?
I guess I would go back to multi-layer redundancy and information. I use the term redundancy from my old automotive days, right?
Okay.
So different technology has to check against one another,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
We're talking about the same thing here on the upstream. So the documentation, the data points, the traceability, they all need to be saying the same thing, but in a different way.
Right.
You can also have geolocation into that. You can also have satellite imagery, et cetera. I'm not so sure that what I know we haven't done is all of that isn't brought together,
Right.
right? And it's not brought together in such a way that also is being deployed for accuracy and efficiency by our government entities to really move these supply chains. We've got to get those efforts to come together and fit hand in glove into the policy and the regulatory ecosystem as well.
If I might ask you to use an example that's a little bit more tactical, and that's the Uyghur example with the passport that's utilized by the Customs and Border Patrol. If you could kind of like link that together just to show like a real tactical example of how the passport is used to trace information to make sure that material is valid for acceptance into the U.S.
Yeah, great question. Um, and we'll just back up a little bit and talk about the impetus of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We have to I mean, the interesting thing about that policy is it is very much a bipartisan supported policy, right?
Right.
And the U.S. has a 1937 trade regulation that when it comes to forced labor, the U.S. has a rare, differing from other Western nations, can seize goods because of that upstream forced labor integration. And so this is a very bipartisan supported bill, and but it is also very prescriptive, and it is also very stringent. And there can be, when it comes to forced labor, there can be no mixing or no de minimis of forced labor into those supply chains. I have enjoyed the last year or so working on a standard with ASTM specifically on the traceability and validation of upstream information, the application of digital technologies for that specific policy. And what we're talking about is a thread of digital information along the supply chain from every single participant. And then we're talking about attached documentation that is authenticated and written up to the blockchain for that by every single one of those providers. And then we're talking about the handover and the culmination of that information into a product passport that makes it easy and gives all that information that is validated to the USCBP so they can fast track the products that clearly show they don't have forced labor, and they can hold and increase their accuracy of holding stuff that is suspicious and needs further detail. So yeah, it's I think CBP, they've done a global business transparency initiative. They're certainly they're certainly got skin in the game on investigating how digital technologies can really help them.
Absolutely.
Especially with a very difficult and prescriptive regulation.
Yeah, I can see, the term passport, to me, it brings something very, very clear. Not only it gets me access, but it also carries all the places I've been. So you can look through all the stamps. So you can see all of the checkpoints, all of the different validations that have come. So obviously it's a digital passport. So there's an awful lot of data. And I know you've pointed throughout our conversation to that data management, data exchange, what's required and so forth. And so developing that standard to be able to transfer that data is really the most important piece. If you think about it, it's kind of like the long pole in the tent. You can have all the data in the world, but if you can't transfer, you can't utilize it, you can't demonstrate what it contains, then it becomes worthless at that point.
And I think that's what's exciting about what, say, the G7 came out with in terms of critical minerals and a commitment to passports as well. I was actually kind of like, oh, okay, they're saying the word passports too, so they like it like you, Al. But what we're talking about here is all these nations and a market of about 2.33 billion is collecting a lot of data. Now, how are we going to use that data and specific data that that doesn't infringe on IP sharing, et cetera, but how are we going to be prescriptive and defining of the data that's needed for certain policies to start incentivizing Western and allied and G7 production of certain critical minerals and materials that make us more secure.
Absolutely. Well, I know that we've been talking about this for quite some time. So if you had your magic wand, what would be the next steps that you would take to make sure that you arrive where you want to arrive in 5 years? And what would be the 2 or 3 key steps that you would wave your magic wand to make sure would appear?
No, I think we have a very helpful North Star in what needs to be done now, right? We need to recognize that we need to close the gap between all this data gathering, as you suggest,
Yeah.
and the creation of a $2.33 billion market where data is being exchanged and we are promoting responsible, sustainable production of critical minerals that help our economies. So we've got a long way to get there.
Yeah.
Lots of education. We're going to need to look at the landscape of domestic policies across those different markets and look at where there's harmonization and start proposing that that's the harmonization that needs to happen.
Okay.
Say Department of War, what they're doing on rare earths and batteries, those are examples and best case scenarios that should also be applied by other defense procurement around the world, right? But then we need to talk about, how is that being done? What's required and what are we talking about? So I guess in the next 5 years, I would like there to be a ubiquitous understanding of how we differentiate minerals and materials made within the Western world. And we have the policy provisions across trade, incentives, procurement that have been and are moving those supply chains in the way our nations need.
So what would be in the short term in 2026? What would you see as the next best step that the U.S. could take, let's say, the U.S. and its allies and partners, to ensure traceability, to remove all of those risks that you say can be consolidated? But what would be the next best step to kind of congeal all of those disparate policies to help kind of move this forward?
Battery and magnet incentives and trade mechanisms that are aligned and account for full supply chain visibility and a reliable proof of the provenance and where they came from.
All right. Well, Ellen, thank you very much. Before we close, I just want to know, once the holidays are over, what's the top 2 or 3 things on your to-do list when you get back to work after the holidays? What's your key focus for 2026?
Let's specify the policies globally where there's harmonization in terms of reliable data exchange and traceability, and then go try to influence the right stakeholders and how we get that done.
Great. Well, Ellen, thank you very much for your time this morning. I really appreciate all of your insights, and I want to make sure that we keep this dialogue going. Thanks again, Ellen.
You really appreciate your interest and your leadership in the area. I'll very much appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Ellen. And to everyone who listened or watched this episode, thank you for joining us. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to keep enjoying the Minerals and Metals Initiative.